People can hear in the back? All right, we're going to try to keep you cool and comfortable on the tour today. As I said before, I'm Donna Curtin, the director of the Pilgrim Society and Pilgrim Hall Museum, and today the topic of our tour is Mr. Davis's neighborhood. Now, how many of you remember or have heard of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood? All right, so familiar character. So have you heard of him? Well, maybe you can watch him sometime. So Mr. Rogers created this wonderful sort of fantasy world of the Magic Kingdom with all of these interesting characters out of his imagination. Yeah, well, it was aired for many years on PBS as Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. So I'm making a little comparison between sort of entering into that wonderfully developed community that came out of his imagination into a historic world that was created by one of Plymouth's historic residents, William Thomas Davis. We call him William T. Davis, or I might say just William T., and you'll know who I'm talking about. So William Thomas Davis wasn't a famous public television star by any means, but he was known very widely locally here as a historian of note, and someone who really recorded Plymouth's history in prodigious detail and with a very wide scope of interest. His books included Ancient Landmarks of Plymouth in 1883, a history of the town of Plymouth that he published in 1885, and my very favorite, Plymouth Memoirs of an Octogenarian, that he published in 1906, shortly before his death at age 85. So in the preface, Davis kind of tells us what, in his own words, he was seeking to achieve in that particular volume. And he says, "By the death of every person, something is lost within the range of his study and knowledge beyond recovery. In publishing this book of memories, it is my desire to rescue from oblivion persona and events coming under my observation during a long life, and to make a record of habits and customs and fashions which have prevailed at different periods within my knowledge. The book is not intended to be either in any sense an autobiography or a mere collection of interesting reminiscences, but a legacy which I wish to leave for the benefit of those coming after me." So if any of you have ever taken a Burial Hill tour, how many would that be? A few of you have encountered William Thomas Davis's legacy. I can assure you, many of the stories of the people that are buried here come directly from his writings, his research, and his work. He was a lifelong Plymouthian, and one of his most notable characteristics was that he actually paid attention to pretty much everything. This is a lost art in our own time, so I'm going to bring you to William Davis as a good example. He looked at people, he looked at places, he looked at events. If you want to know in Plymouth's past, for example, how families lived, what was day-to-day life like for them? What was their house like? What was it like on the outside? What about if you stepped on the inside? How about when was the very first tomato planted in Plymouth? Back in the olden days, the gentlemen used to wear knee breeches. Well, when was the last person to wear knee breeches recorded in this town? And everybody started wearing you gentlemen are wearing knee breeches, I see. But, when they switched to pants. You want to know that kind of thing. You want to know when people stopped cooking their food in a fireplace and began to use a stove? If you want to find out how Plymouth kids used to make their own homemade footballs, it's really disgusting. And maybe at the end of the tour I'll tell you. And what local teachers were like. All of these were the things that Davis recorded and wrote about. He's our source. And he not only captured the stories of his own generation, his own memories, his friends, his family, but he went back to the older generations. He talked to old people, and he got their information and stories as well. So we're going to take a little stroll this afternoon around the hill, and we're going to meet some of Mr. Davis's neighborhood. All right, so let's head down to the next shady spot that we see. We're going to gather in that shady spot right there, that next tree. Okay, so what we're looking at here is we're not looking at any of the stones. I want you to look at the vista and the view. Now, our view of the downtown is blocked a little bit because we have all of the trees in full leaf right now. But this is always a really wonderful vantage here on Burial Hill of looking what Plymouth liked. And I want you to cast your mind back and envision the town as it might have looked in William Davis's lifetime. He was born March 3rd, 1822, and as I said, he lived until December of 1907. And he was raised in one of Plymouth's leading mercantile families, the Davises. His father, his grandfather, and his great-grandfather were all prosperous and well-known overseas traders here in this maritime community. So as a child, our William T. grew up in his grandfather's house, which is right on the top crest corner of Coles Hill. You know where the old Mayflower, the Wax Museum condos are? Well, before that, there was this big old rambling hotel, and the roots of that old building were the Davis family homestead, a big old wooden home. That's where he grew up, right on Coles Hill, looking out over Plymouth Harbor. And his very earliest experiences were just so flavored with the sights and the sounds of a commercial port in the age of sail. So we might even have a few sails out on the horizon today, modern sailboats, recreational boats. But in Davis's day, you'd have sailing vessels coming and going. His waterfront was a working area with many wharves going out into the harbor. There were some warehouses and early factories and shipbuilders' areas and chandleries, even fish flakes. Anybody know what a fish flake is? Okay, you might see it in old photos like in Nova Scotia and places. They were racks that they would take the codfish and other fish and split them and lay them out to dry in the sun to become dried fish that then could be imported and sold. So there were areas where there were right on the waterfront these fish flakes, including, I believe, right down across the street from behind the Hedge House, right, Ian? I know she's here somewhere. Yeah, there was a nice area of probably stinky fish on a day like this that would be down right there. So there are the ships coming in and out, carrying fish and lumber and unloading goods from all distant parts of the world, East India, places near and far. And Davis absolutely loved the bustle and excitement of this waterfront. He would explore the wharves with all their bales and cargo, watching them being stowed and unstowed, and he was what we might consider a real wharf rat. So he was kind of critical of the landlubbers, and he would watch people as they went onto a ship and how they might go up the mast to the working top, the crow's nest, and around the mast itself is an opening called the lubber's hole. And if little William Davis saw someone climbing up to get up to that vista on the working top, and they went through the lubber's hole, instead of like a sailor would do it, a real sailor would do it by climbing out along the rigging and the shrouds, the sails that went around the side. You would have to go way out along the edge of the rigging and then pop yourself in to the top of the working top. But if you went up through the lubber's holes, he and his mates would be there saying, well, look at that lubber over there going up the easy way. That's not how we do it. So he really relished Plymouth's maritime character. And a lot of what he wrote about was some of the people here in town who relied on the sea for their living and livelihood. And we're going to meet one of these sailing folk. We're going to head over back towards the way we came, and we're going to step into a sunny spot for a bit. So here we are at the stone of Mrs. Fear Bartlett. She was the late consort of Captain Isaac Bartlett. She died April 18th, 1811, when she was 32 years old. Now, we're here to really learn a little bit more about her husband, Captain Bartlett. So a little over a year after Fear Bartlett died, Captain Isaac Bartlett, her widowed husband, remarried to a relative of his, Rebecca Bartlett. And he's actually buried in Oak Grove Cemetery next to his second wife. He's not here. But he was a shipmaster in the Havana trade, so he was involved in going from Plymouth down to Cuba and back. He commanded the brig Hannah that was owned by Barnabas Hedge, one of our Hedge family connections. And our little William T. Davis had this very agreeable memory of when Captain Bartlett would arrive home in Plymouth in port, having come from Cuba, and he would be carrying his usual cargo, which was molasses. There would be these big barrels of molasses that would probably be oozing some of that sticky brown molasses. And so what he would do is he would go up, he was probably about your age, and he would take a little stick. Well, yeah, he was probably about 10. I could see him doing this at 10. He'd go up, that barrel of molasses would be as big as you are. It would be a big barrel of molasses, and it would have a hole in it called a bung hole that would have a stopper in it to keep. That's how you would get the molasses out, but you would have to keep it bunged up tight. But he would take a little stick, and he would work the stick in next to the bung hole. And when he could get into where the molasses was, there's some process that I remember from like science class as a kid, whereby the liquid would drip down the stick and flow directly into his mouth. And he would just suck on that molasses. Now, that may sound really disgusting to us because we don't generally think of molasses as like a really fun thing. But back then, remember, molasses was a key ingredient in cakes and desserts and candy. So, and it was a sweetener that was used in New England cuisine. And so this would have been like, it would have been like, I'm going to take this liquid candy and just put it right in my mouth. So he was very, very fond of that. Now, molasses was an important commodity coming into Plymouth. It wasn't just used for baking and cooking. It was used for another important industry that was here locally and also very much in Boston. Does anyone know what it was used for? Yes, I think I heard it. Say it louder. Rum. Excellent. Hey-ho. Yes, for the distillation of rum relied on molasses, and that was one reason why it was imported here. Now, I'm going to have us all go over here to the shady spot. It's too hot, and I'm going to finish talking a little bit about our ship's captains here. So, in addition to these wonderful stories of our little wharf rat enjoying, exploring that waterfront and all those pleasures, he was always a very keen observer of Plymouth's shipping industry and its fisheries. You want to know how many barrels of mackerel were brought in a given year. Sometimes Davis will give you that information. But he also tells us about some of the deep sea adventures. And he talks about the development of Plymouth's first whaling industry. Now, this happened about the time the town was 200 years old. When would that have been? Oh, lovely. And Davis said, well, it took about 200 years for Plymouth to develop any kind of whaling industry, and then, sadly, it did not last very long. But what happened was, before about 1820, by law, actually, local whaling was mostly by salvage. It happened when a whale beached on the shore. People didn't go out to, go after the whales here. They would just come, and when they beached, by law, the town owned 2/3 of any salvaged whale. And any resident that wanted to go and retrieve the whale and strip it down and try out the blubber and get the oil would be entitled to 1/3 of the whale, and the town would receive all the rest. So you'd have to do the work, you'd have to take the whale, you'd have to salvage it, and the town would get 2/3 and you'd get 1/3. So up until about 1820, that was the case. But then in 1821, Plymouth's first whaling company was formed. And these were members of the Bartlett family, the Barnes family, and the Hedge family. And they came together, mostly young men. They were very entrepreneurial, and they were willing to take a risk on something new. So they invested their money in fitting out a ship of about 345 ton. They named the ship after a famous vessel associated with some of their ancestors. Any guesses? The Mayflower. Very good. And they fitted it out, and it sailed for the Pacific that fall in 1821. Now, this was an amazingly energizing project here in Plymouth. So many local business folks and tradesmen got involved in this. I mean, you had to fit the ship out. So it involved the coopers and the bakers and the chandlers and the mechanics. Everybody got a little boost of energy from this new venture and was so excited about it. Ship goes out. It's gone for 3 years. And when it comes back in, it's bearing almost 3,000 barrels of whale oil. And in the meantime, our entrepreneurial young men, you know what they did? They had, in the meantime, started to establish some related industry by creating an oil and candle factory. So when that oil came back, they were ready to make things out of it and do things with it and sell it. It all seemed so wonderful and exciting. And the next year in 1822, they sent out a second ship. They named it after the second ship that arrived in Plymouth in the 17th century. And Very good. Okay, she gets a gold star. The Fortune, yes, they named it the Fortune. They had a little less imagination in the ship naming area, I think. But anyway, so they had these early ships that went out, but what happened was Plymouth, unfortunately, could not compete with some other nearby ports that had deeper water harbors, and they could just really let that trade grow. Can anyone think of a nearby port? Yes, exactly. Yeah, New Bedford slammed us. We got slammed by New Bedford, and Plymouth never really did have much of a whaling industry after that point. So for our little MT growing up at this exciting period, it was always something that was a little wistful for him when he would talk about sailing and fishing. You know, to him that meant fishing vessels going out. And although he was he acknowledged and he even celebrated some of the other economic developments in Plymouth, including the rise of industry and manufacturing like the Cordage Company in North Plymouth. He thought that was really terrific for the town. And he may have been, it would be interesting to know what he thought of the vessels that are going out today, not the whalers, not the coastal trading vessels or the far distant ports, but going out on whale watching cruises. I mean, I think he would have been happy to see vessels coming and going out of our port even today. But let's think for a moment of this young man. Who influences you when you're growing up? Who influences? Who do you think maybe helps you think about things in different ways? Oh, teachers, fantastic. Let's go visit a teacher right around the corner here. And we're going to talk about this wonderful stone and our young William T. Davis. Now, he was very, very attached to his very first teacher. And her name was Mrs. Patty Weston. And this is her gravestone. It says that she was, I don't know if it says on the stone, but she was born in 1763. And when she was 21, she married Coomer Weston, a local sea captain and merchant. And he died after about, I think they had been married 12 years. He's buried right next to her, I believe. This is his stone right next, Coomer Weston. And she's buried here with her son, Thomas. He also went in a life at the sea, but he died at Martinique when he was out on a voyage, and his body was not returned to Plymouth. So he's memorialized on the stone. He's not buried with his mother, but he's memorialized. The husband does die while he's on a voyage out at Martha's Vineyard, but they do return his body, and he is interred here on Burial Hill. So this is the Weston family. Now, Davis, when he was 4 years old, remember he's growing up on that wonderful old building at the top of Coles Hill. So that's what we today, have as North Street, going up and down and Carver Street swings around. So right up at the top of North Street were these little old building where the Weston family lived. And today I think Dillon Antiques is still there, those little buildings. So one of these buildings was Dame Patty Weston and her husband's home. And that's where she lived as a widow. And having lost her husband and her son, she now had to support herself. So what did she do? She opened a dame's school in the house. And she became a teacher in order to survive and continue here. So she was up at the top of the hill, and Davis is a little boy down at the bottom of the hill. And this dame school was really like a daycare facility. That's what we would consider it today. It was for the youngest kids. She took them as young as 2 all the way up to the age of about 6 or 7. And they would come to her twice a day. And every day except Sunday, you would have to go to school at Dame Weston's. On Saturday, you'd have a half a day, and you'd stay with her in the morning. You'd have your lessons, and then you would go home, and you would have your afternoon meal, dinner, and then you would come back after dinner, and you would have an afternoon session with her, and then you would go home. Every day of the week except Sunday and a half a day. And the cost, we'll hear about that a little bit later on, how much that cost. But here's what Davis said about this. He describes, she would teach reading and writing and sewing to the youngest kids in the group. And he remembered the schoolroom where she taught her lessons had a sanded floor and a cricket on which I sat. Does any young person here know what he means by that? Sitting on a cricket. What could that mean? Does anyone know what a cricket is? Yeah. A little chair, a small stool, a little chair, absolutely. Those, if you ever see one so low to the ground, just tiny little legs, that's called a cricket. So he remembers sitting on the cricket in that classroom, and it had a sanded floor. We'll find out what that means in a little bit. And he says, from that dear lady with a pleasant smile and kindly voice, I first tasted the sweet food of kindly uttered knowledge. And he was so grateful. He says, few of her scholars can now be left to join with me in blessing her memory when she died in 1841. But there was another student who did also write down some information about Dame Weston. She was called sometimes Marm or Ma'am, but Marm Weston was one of the names her student called her. And up on North Street, there was another student who was just a few years younger than William T. And she recorded some of the similar memories. Remember that sanded floor that Davis talked about? Well, Laura Russell really explains what that meant. So Marm Weston would take clean beach sand, and she would bring it into her home, and she would spread it on the wooden floor, and then she would take her broom, and she would sweep a herringbone pattern into the sand. And the students would come in, and they would take their little crickets, and they would gather around her in a circle on this wonderful clean beach sand. Wouldn't that be fun, to be in a house with, like, beach sand on it? Now, she only had 2 books. She had the Bible and the Farmer's Almanac, so that would be your lesson. She'd do a reading from one of the books, and sometimes these little students, they're ages 2 to ages 6, you know how sometimes they get a little rambunctious. So Marm Weston had a little strategy. She would have her thimble on her finger, and she would just go right up and tap a young rambunctious person right on their top of their head. And if they were acting up, she would just give them a little tap with the thimble. And if that did not work, she would say, take your cricket and go to Bantam. And she would point to the far distant corner of the room. Take your little stool and go to the far corner of the room. You're going to sit there until you can calm down. Right? That's not a bad strategy. But what the heck does that mean, go to Bantam? Well, remember, she's coming from a sailing family. And Bantam is a port in Indonesia. So for Marm Weston, it's like, I'm going to send them to the farthest corner of the known universe. You take that cricket and you go to Bantam, and when you're ready to behave, you come back into the circle with the rest of us. So, there's a lot of wonderful details about Marm Weston. She kept a little black teapot in her chimney, and when she was thirsty, she would take it out and drink right from the spout. So she was a bit unusual, perhaps, but Davis was so deeply affectionate and grateful for her introducing him to a world of learning and knowledge. He did not have as nice things to say about some of his other teachers here in Plymouth. I'm sorry to tell you this, but he describes things like switchings. Anybody know what a switching is? You take a long, skinny piece of a tree, and you use it to hit your students with. And beatings and humiliations that the teachers would sometimes carry out against the students. It was kind of a hard experience. So Davis, when he was young with some of his pals, would sometimes decide they were going to get back. And so one of their tricks is right down at the bottom of Burial Hill is School Street. That is where one of the local schools was, and that is where David went to when he graduated from Marm Weston's. He's going to the one-room schoolhouse right down here on the hill. And what they do is, in the cool time of year, as the season was changing from fall into winter, the little one-room schoolhouse had a stove in it so the students could stay warm. But it wasn't quite cold enough for that stove to be being used every day. So the students would go down to the beach, and they would gather up some nice, gooey, wet seaweed. And they would come back, and they would stuff the seaweed down the chimney of the schoolhouse. And then they would play this trick once on a new teacher, because you can only do it once. And then they would sit there and pretend to shiver. Like, oh, it's a little chilly. It's kind of cold. Oh, schoolmaster, can we please light the fire? Can you light the fire? And the schoolmaster would light the fire, and the wet seaweed would start to smoke. And the entire school had to be evacuated and school dismissed for the day. So he describes these kind of little tensions that would go on between the students and the teachers there. Now, the good news is David was a good student. He was a very brilliant man. Loved to read, loved to study. And he went on from Plymouth Public Schools to graduate from Harvard in 1842. And then he went on further to study law at his brother Charles's law office in Boston. And then he went to Harvard Law School and passed the bar in 1849, becoming an attorney. And he returns back to his hometown to practice law. But now, let me ask you one other question. Who else influences you in your life other than those teachers? Good one. Yep. What's that? Your parents. I love it. Family. Good answer. Let's go meet some family. Right over this way. And we're going to follow that path right over here. So this is the grave of William Thomas Davis, rather remarkable grandfather. So he was a prosperous merchant in Plymouth, and he was remembered as ardently devoted to the interests of his native town. He represented Plymouth in the General Court as a representative, and in 1812 and 1813 he was also a member of the State Executive Council. He was one of the selectmen of the town of Plymouth, and he served for about 30 years. He was also a president of the Plymouth Bank, and at the time of his death, he was a vice president of the Pilgrim Society, which is the organization I work for today. And he was very deeply interested in the history of early Plymouth, and he was also said to be energetic and very cheerful. Now, William Thomas Davis only knew his grandfather, the Honorable William, for a very few short years. His father, his own father, was also a William Davis, just to keep us all on our toes. And his father also served as a selectman. He was also concerned in the family business and navigation and trade. But his own dad died when he was just 41 years old, and little William was just 2. So Davis describes what happened to his dad. His father was up in Boston. He was preparing a brig to take a voyage out to sea. He was suddenly taken ill, and a fellow Plymouth Sea captain, Captain Simmons, hurried him back home in a chaise. He said, "We've got to get you back home to Plymouth." He gets back home to Plymouth, and he passes away just 2 days later. He doesn't make it. And Davis was always grateful to this Plymouth Sea captain, George Simmons, not just for bringing his father home so he could die with his family at home, but also because George Simmons was so close to the Davis family, he named 2 of his own children after William T.'s parents. So one of the Simmons boys was William Davis Simmons, and one of the Simmons girls was Joanna White Simmons, after Davis's mother. So the families were very, very, very close. But this family example of his grandfather and father, had an influence on Davis. Now, he didn't go into the family business. He didn't become a merchant. He didn't go to sea. As we said, he studied law. And actually, at first, he took a little diversion. He studied medicine for a few years at first before he decided he would go into the law. But he did follow very much in his paternal and great-paternal footsteps by becoming a leader of his community. He was chosen 17 times as a town selectman. He served as moderator at more than 70 town meetings. That's a lot of town meetings. He was a state senator in 1858 and 1859. He was a president of the Plymouth Bank, just like his grandfather was. He was also a president of a newfangled outfit, the Plymouth Gas Company, when that came along. He was a director of the Cohasset-Duxbury Railroad Company. Doesn't that sound intriguing? Would be very nice if we had a Cohasset-Duxbury Railroad right now these days. And he was also a vice president and a president of the Pilgrim Society, my organization, Pilgrim Hall Museum, serving from 1860 to 1878, so all through the period of the Civil War and afterwards. And although he writes generally rather sparingly of his own family relations, Davis did find it worthy of mention that the services of members of 4 generations of my family as selectmen cover a period of 52 years. So he's really proud that in that recent family history, his family had served their community in that way. He was also felt that family connection was important. So he dedicated this book of Plymouth Memories to his own children. And he said, with the hope that they will remember with love and pride their native town and be always ready to render it useful service. So community spirit, absolutely. We're going to move down a little bit, and I'm hoping that this is Samuel Davis. Does anyone see Samuel there? Can anyone make out Samuel? That's Samuel?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, there's a long inscription on this one. It says, Samuel died in 1829. He was 65 years old. And it says, "From life on earth our pensive friend retires, his dust commingling with his pilgrim sires. In thoughtful walks their every path he traced, their toils, their tombs, his faithful page embraced. Peaceful and pure and innocent as they, with them to rise to everlasting day." So this is our William T's. This is his great uncle Samuel. And when he died. Davis was only 7 years old, but he remembers going to his great uncle's funeral, and he wrote about his great uncle. He remembered some things about his great uncle who influenced him. He was described as a well-known antiquarian, a learned linguist, and a recognized authority on questions relating to Indian dialects. He was a member of the Massachusetts Historical Society. He had received an honorary degree from Harvard. He was very deeply versed in Plymouth history. And according to one obituary, this is how he was described. The man to whom the inquisitive stranger was by all of us promptly referred. There was an accuracy and precision in the habit of his mind that made all his minute and curious information perfectly to be relied on. He was what the world would call a man of leisure. But this leisure was no ignoble escape from thought. In other words, he wasn't just sitting around, lazing around, doing nothing. He was being constructive. He loved Pilgrim history, tracing out their original allotments, their first rude dwellings. He knew their sons and daughters, their intermarriages, their changes of abode. And of all these things, he made copious memoranda. So at Pilgrim Hall Museum, we actually have some of the notes and records of great uncle Samuel, and he's one of the ones that, for example, did little drawings of the early churches down in the square that no longer exist. We would have no idea what they looked like except the little sketches that he did, and he would have, little arrows and descriptions saying, how they were built and when they were built and other little details. So now Davis liked to interpret his great uncle's intellectual proclivities kind of in moral terms, and this is how he described it. He said, Great Uncle Samuel was very fond of history and biography, but he was disgusted by the Caesars and the Napoleons and the Charleses of history. I think he's thinking of King Charles I. And for 30 years, he persevered with delight in learning the minutest particulars of ordinary people, the Pilgrims. So he really liked that his great uncle didn't pay attention to the great men of history, but really wanted to know kind of what were the lives of ordinary people like. So our Samuel Davis, he died after taking his evening walk. It was a July in 1829. He sat down in his chamber about 10 o'clock. That was 10 o'clock p.m. That was when his day would end. And he would always end his day by recording in his diary what the weather had been. And then the next morning they found him still sitting in his chair, his arms folded on his breast, a tranquil end to a peaceful life, it was described as. But one of the things I think that was carried on by young William T. from his great uncle was this minute attention to detail, but also a regard and respect for ordinary lives, not just great histories. And now we're going to go over here and look at this stone. These are some of the very, very humble people of William Davis's community. They were his childhood neighbors, Aunt Debbie and Uncle Eben Drew, and they lived on North Street in a little house that was once right behind where the Wax Museum building, the condos are today. And it was a little double house, and at one end was the home of Eben and Debbie Drew, and at the other side was occupied by Malachi Drew. He was their Eben's bachelor brother, never married, but they lived side by side. So Davis called them the salt of the earth. They were good neighbors to the Davis family. He said Malachi would come over and help repair the roof. He would fix doors. He would mend chairs. He would keep the house generally in running order. Uncle Eben would feed and scratch the pigs. Now, I love that detail. You can just see him going out with the slop pail, feeding the pigs, then reaching over to give those. And has anyone ever scratched a pig? I've scratched a pig, and they love it. So he was being very nice to the pig. He would saw and split the firewood. He would wheel the corn. He'd take the Davis family's corn, because Davis says everybody bought or raised their own corn, and you'd send it to the mill to be ground, and Uncle Eben would take it. But he would make sure that miller, and it's interesting that the miller is named by Davis. He says that miller, Sylvanus Maxim, to make sure he did not take out too much toll. So the miller gets a share of the grinding, but you got to watch those millers, that they don't take more than their share. So Uncle Eben would look after that. He would go down from his house right up on the top of Coles Hill there on North Street, and he would go down to the wharf, and he had a little hand cart. And as travelers and tourists started coming into Plymouth and coming off the steamship and coming off the vessels arriving at the port, he'd be there with the luggage. And, all right, sir, let's take your luggage up to the hotel. And he'd make a little money that way. And Davis would always bring him apples. He loved apples, but Uncle Eben unfortunately had lost his teeth. And so he really couldn't eat apples anymore. But Davis would bring him the apples, and he would take the apples, and he would peel the apples with his jackknife. And then he would scrape at the apple so it would be kind of mushy, and then he would be able to eat the apple. Now, Davis says, this is his words, the chief of these blessed three was Aunt Debbie. She would make soap and candles. She was a folk healer. She would nurse the sick. She would diagnose the various diseases of children, such as measles, by their smell. She'd go over, well, you got a sick one there? All right, here's the problem. Here's what we're going to do about it. She would administer yarb tea. Doesn't that sound lovely? Herbal tea as remedies. And she would also know a lot of these other folk remedies, like what to do when you've cut your finger and you're bleeding. She would take cobwebs, or she would also take poplar buds or balm of Gilead. These were plants that were grown locally. But she would take the cobwebs and she would make a bandage out of it for your wound and help heal you. Davis thought she was just as good as more scientific weather forecasters in her ability to predict snowstorms. And whenever he came from college, his very first visit was always, not to his own mom, to Aunt Debbie, to visit Aunt Debbie. And at Thanksgiving time, he called it his privilege to bear a turkey and a couple of pies to her scanty board. So she died at 1844 at the age of 72, and he says, peace to her ashes. So I love this, that we have William T. Davis thinking of just the ordinary. We would not know anything about these folks. We would barely know their names if Davis didn't tell us. And what rich detail. Can't you just see them up on the top, living in their little house and helping their neighbors and interacting with the tourists? So we're here a little bit in the Irish section of Burial Hill. We have a Hibernian from Ireland here, Andrew Farrell. And this fallen grave is the grave of Anne, the wife of John Cassidy, who died July 20th, 1860, in her 77th year. So the family of John Cassidy is one that William Thomas Davis writes about in his Plymouth Memoirs. And this was one of the first, if not the first, Irish family to come here and become residents of Plymouth. And Davis writes very candidly about how the character of Plymouth was changing as families started coming in from other parts of the world, Portuguese and Italians and Germans and Irish. And this was really changing the old English core of old Plymouth. And Davis tells us a little bit about his own attitudes in one of the stories that he writes down in his book. He is talking about a story of how reviled the Irish were when he was a young boy. And he had the chance as a young man to visit with his aunt and uncle in England. He actually, after graduating from Harvard, took a grand tour of Europe. And while there, he visited his aunt and uncle Bancroft. Now, his uncle was George Bancroft. He was one of the most highly influential of American historians in the 19th century. You can look him up. He also served as a Secretary of the Navy under President James K. Polk, and he was minister to England in the time that Davis was visiting him in 1846 and 1849. That was when the Bancrofts were in London, and Davis goes over during that time. He accompanies them one night to the theater, and in the next box, guess who is seated? In the 19th century in England, at the highest level of society, Queen Victoria was seated next to him in the box. And after that, the show, there was a wonderful dinner with many of the, greatest lights of London society at the time. And here's our little William, the wharf rat, sitting there at the dinner table there. He doesn't mention that Queen Victoria attended the party. But one of the guests was a very famous Scottish philosopher of the time called Thomas Carlyle. And while Davis is sitting at the table, one of the guests turns to this he was at the height of, British literature at the time, the talked about in these revered tones. And one of the other guests turned to Carlyle and asked him what he would propose to do about the Irish. Now, this is the time of the Irish famine. right? This is right at those years of the Irish famine. And the issue was phrased as the Irish question. Like, it's not just that people are dying of hunger in Ireland. What are we going to do about this problem with the Irish? Carlyle smacks his hand down on the table and then says, I would shoot every mother's son of them. That was his response. Davis is completely shocked by this. He records the story. So he's taking, one of this, famous men of his own time, and he's saying, look at this. Look at what that man said. And he's also, coming back home. America was certainly going through its own very intense period of anti-Irish sentiment, right? At the same period of time, we had a party called the Know Nothing, and that was one of their platforms, was very, very hostile to these new families coming into settle in America. But Davis's own tone when he's writing about Irish families who came to Plymouth is very, very different. And I think it kind of sets him apart and gives us a little insight into his character at this time when these opinions are out there and considered to be perfectly okay to express. Here's what Davis says about the Cassidy family. He says, within my day, the first Irishman to come to town was John Cassidy, about 1820 or 30. He had been living for a time in Boston, and there his son, John S., our townsman, was born. He was a blacksmith by trade and a man of striking appearance. He had 2 daughters whom I knew very well, fine women, Elizabeth and Ellen. So Davis just gives us this little snippet, but he makes a point of saying that the son of the first Irishman in Plymouth, who was born up in Boston but then comes and settles in Plymouth, is our townsman. He's our townsman. He's as much a part of Plymouth as Davis is himself. And when we look at Davis's own lineage and history, we see he's as blue-blooded as they get. He's a Mayflower descendant multiple times. And it's interesting that in talking about what he calls foreign immigration in Plymouth during his lifetime, Davis sees many positive contributions. In addition to considering these Irish families as his fellow townsmen, he also talks about some of the Portuguese and Italians who are coming into Plymouth in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And one of the things he notices about these new arrivals from those Mediterranean countries is they're really great at gardening. And he says it's not just tending their own family plots, but they're also raising really great local produce for market. And he gives them credit for benefiting Plymouth by, as he says, reviving its agricultural heritage. So I think that's pretty forward thinking of this man of the 19th century to be saying. All right, do we have time for one more? All right, we're going to go over to the Cushman Monument. Almost there. We're doing a quick stop here, and then there's one more. And then it's off to seek some... I was almost going to make a molasses beverage for today called switchel. Does anybody know of switchel? So I grew up, my grandparents had a farm here on the South Shore, and we used to, in the height of the season, go haying. There's nothing more hot than harvesting hay. It has to be perfectly dry, very hot weather, because you can't have any moisture in the hay or it'll rot. But they used to serve a very old drink called switchel, and you make it with water and molasses and vinegar, and it's mixed together. And it sounds dreadful, but I think it's probably got a lot of electrolytes or something in it, because on the hot day when you were doing the haying, it was great. So I thought I should really, after the molasses, stealing episode, I should make some switchel for everybody. But I apologize, I didn't get around to the switchel. There you go. I like the way you think. Okay. All right. So we're actually looking at, there's a row of the Rogers family down there out in the blazing sun. We're going to stay here in the shade. And at the far end, down by the steps that are leading down, is little Lydia Rogers. And she was the daughter of America Rogers and his wife, Eliza Rogers. I love that name, America Rogers. And she died when she was just a little one. She was 2 years old and 1 month when she died in 1840. But we're going to talk about her father, America Rogers, because he was one of the best bakers in Plymouth. Now, one of the things that Davis likes to write about is food. He's a foodie, and there's actually a wonderful local food historian, Paula Marcoux, who has gleaned information out of Davis and found related family recipes. And she actually has a cookbook that someday is going to be published by the Antiquarian Society, and we're all going to buy it and love it. that will have some of those recipes in it. And I've actually made a couple of them too, and they're fantastic. But so he describes a lot of food and cookery things, and one of his things is down in the downtown. There was an old building on Middle Street that is no longer there, but it had 2 stories. It was called the Shirtlift Tavern, and one of the first floor areas was a candy store, and it was kept by 2 ladies who were known only as Nancy and Eliza. And Nancy never married. She was Nancy Paulding. She's buried here in Burial Hill. And Eliza was the wife of George Straffen. But the 2 ladies would make these wonderful candies. And here is what Davis said about them. I wish to embalm their memories in gratitude for the satisfaction my youthful taste often received at their hand. And I just love that. Embalming in gratitude their memories. But he would talk a lot about the baking industry in Plymouth, and you have to realize this is a seafaring town, so many of the bakers specialized in producing one type of baked product. Any guesses what that might be? Ship's biscuit, absolutely. Sometimes known as hardtack. Right, a very dry kind of bread. He also called it sea biscuit. And he describes, watching the sea biscuit. It was packed into casks, into coopered casks, and then it would be taken aboard a ship and it would last for a long time, and they'd be able to have it on these very, very long voyages. So local families also, their families, the men of the household had been going out to sea, and they were accustomed to this, so people ate it at their own table as well. So he recalls America Rogers being one of the bakers of the sea biscuit. He would go around with a little cart in town, this little 2-wheel cart, and he would deliver, pretty much every morning, he would deliver the sea biscuit to the Davis household. And he said the size and color of which varied with the price and the quality of the flour. So the sea biscuit could be made out of all kinds of different flours. It could have rye, it could have corn, it could have wheat, and kind of depending on what the baker could get, it might be darker if it had more of the darker grains in it, might be larger, be varied. But he thought it was pretty tasty stuff. Another one of the local biscuit bakers was a Mr. Churchill, and he was a little bit of a jokester. And he liked to comment about how Plymouth people would just, kind of, they were always thinking of newfangled ideas. I guess the town had a reputation for those transcendentalists coming in and giving lectures and everybody getting excited about that and all this kind of stuff. And he says, oh yeah, those Plymouth people will swallow anything. I know by good experience, for I've stuffed them with poor bread for many a year. So that was Mr. Churchill, but not America Rogers. His level of baking was up there, according to our foodie, William Davis. He thought that especially on election day, that's when the bakers really would show their stuff, and America Rogers would make these election cakes and buns and goodies. Now remember, election day is a holiday in Davis's time. The day you need to vote is a day off because you can't go out to sea and vote at the same. You can't tend to your field and do it. So it was a holiday, and there would be holiday food. So these bakers would make these wonderful, and he would, there's a little sense of ecstasy there that election day was accompanied by, this wonderful feasting, and he remembered America Rogers. It makes me hungry right now. It must be getting to be lunch. All right, we've got one more stop. Hardtack and switchel. Boy, delicious, right? All right, let's head over to the Cushman Monument, and I want you to go down the slope from it where you're in the shade. Now, Davis is growing up in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. Plymouth is changing rapidly as a community at that time. Is this thing still on? It is? Okay, can't hear it anymore. It's changing from a small farming community. It's becoming a mercantile and manufacturing town. And it also, just before he was born, becomes the county seat when the 1820 courthouse is built, right? This becomes the county seat. That's sort of a mark of Plymouth's status and importance in the local area. But between his grandfather's childhood and Davis's childhood, the town's population pretty much doubles. So about 1830, there are 4,800 people living in the booming metropolis of Plymouth here. And there were new streets laid out during this time when we think of, a lot of the streets in the downtown connecting the main highway or Court Street or Main Street with the Water Street area. A lot of those streets were laid out and identified, during his lifetime. There were, the expansion of shipperies. There were banks and institutions that were created. We have the Cordage Company up in North Plymouth. We have Pilgrim Hall Museum, the town's first museum, comes along in this time. And one of the most exciting things to Davis was the fact that the town got its own newspaper in 1822. What's the name? Old Colony Memorial, yeah. And he would go into the offices of the paper as a boy because he was really fascinated by the process. He would see the printing press would be run every Friday morning and evening, and he knew all of the typesetters and all of the printers, and he would help them fold the newspapers. Every single one had to be folded by hand, and then they'd be distributed to the town. We have in the collection of Pilgrim Hall Museum a whole set of those early original copies of the Old Colony Memorial. Really beautiful, beautiful paper, and lots of tremendously interesting details in them. But one of the printers that Davis admired was Benjamin Drew. Now, Benjamin Drew grew up down the hillside here, all the way to what we today might know as the Jenny House Museum. Do you know where that is? Okay, that little historic house was where he was born in 1812, at the corner of Spring Lane and Summer Street. Now, Benjamin Drew was about 10 years older than William Davis, so it's someone William Davis is looking up to a little bit. But they became lifelong friends. And he's one of the people that William Davis wanted to be remembered. So here is a little bit of Benjamin Drew, William Davis's good friend, his story. Drew started out as an apprentice at the Old Colony Memorial, but then he ends up going into the printing business where he can do better up in Boston. And he becomes involved up there, and he turns to writing and teaching, and for 35 years he's a public school teacher in Boston. In the 1850s, he decides he's going to take some time off and he's going to do some traveling. And he goes up to Upper Canada. And he's so surprised when he's in that area that he's meeting all of these African Americans who have escaped from the United States as fugitive slaves and have gone into Canada where they can be free. And he's meeting them wherever he goes, and he's listening to the stories and talking to them. And this was at the height of slavery, of course, in the American South. Drew himself was an abolitionist, and he saw the individuals that he was meeting as refugees that had important information about what slavery was actually like. So he became an oral historian. This is really before the discipline and field of oral history is even invented, right? But he wants to capture these stories, so he takes notes, he interviews people, and he comes back home. He publishes a book in 1856 called The North Side View of Slavery. It's still a tremendously important resource to scholars to actually hear African American voices recorded, and that's thanks to Benjamin Drew. So he became very well known. He was a pretty influential person in both the printing and in the scholarly fields. And he was invited to St. Paul, Minnesota, where they actually named a school after him. They named a school after him and then said, would you come and teach in the Benjamin Drew School? And so he went out there for a few years, but he ends up in Washington, and he's a proofreader for the U.S. Printing Office. And he becomes an authority on typography. And he published a book called Pen and Types that was a standard in the field for many, many years to come. Finally, he retires, and he comes back home, down the lane, in the little house on the corner of Spring Street and Summer Street, and there he settles. He's in his 70s now. But pretty much every day he would walk up this hill, and he would visit where he had explored so many times as a child here in Plymouth, Burial Hill. Don't we all like to explore up here and just look around? So here you've got Benjamin Drew, this really remarkable person, wandering around the hill, and he realizes something that we can see today, too. He realizes that the stones are kind of getting old and decrepit, and they're flaking, and it's getting hard to read the inscriptions. So he says, I'm going to take a year, and I'm going to write down every word I can find on these stones. And that's what he does. He records the inscriptions on Burial Hill, and he publishes his epitaphs of Burial Hill, and it's one of the resources that we still use today. Some of the stones that he described and wrote down don't even exist anymore. Some of them are, almost impossible to read. So Benjamin Drew did that work. In 1889, his book was published. He was 77 years old. It's never too late, folks, to, get a good project and do something. He died. He lived to be age 91. He died in 1903. And the stones on Burial Hill to Benjamin Drew, as they were to William Davis, these weren't just historical objects. These were very deeply personal things. He knew some of these people. He valued what they had to say. So the value of preserving those memories was something that both Drew and William Davis shared. And I hope this tour of Mr. Davis's neighborhood will help you remember some of our Plymouthians who documented, especially William T. Davis, such a wide slice of life here in our historic town. Thank you. That's the end of the tour.